Four-time New York Times best-selling author William Kent Krueger, creator of the Cork O'Connor murder mystery series, and Ordinary Grace, released in March, came to Northwind Book and Fiber in Spooner Wednesday night, June 26, to talk about his writing career and his two most recent books, Ordinary Grace and Tamarack County, another Cork O'Connor story, the 13th in the series, to be released in August.
Nice turnout! And I hope that you're here for me, but what I really hope more is that you're here for Northwind. And I hope you realize what a gem you have to have a bookstore like this in your hometown. When I was a kid, every town had its own local independent books. You know who's left? Amazon or your local independent bookstore. Now, who do you want making the decisions about what's available to you to read? Do you want this huge, uncaring, amorphous corporation for whom you are nothing but a revenue stream making that decision? Or would you like somebody like Carol helping you with what you're going to read? So, thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting your independent bookstore. And let's all give Northwind a hand. Before I begin, I just want to ask a quick question. Is there anybody here who hasn't read a William Kent Krueger novel? It's okay, you can raise your hands. Okay, get out. I'm just funning with you. I asked that question because I never want to talk to a group assuming that everybody knows who the hell I am and what the hell it is that I do. So for my next few minutes of remarks are for those of you who raised your hands. I'm William Kent Krueger. I go by Kent. I write the Cork O'Connor mystery series, which is set in the great north woods of Minnesota. Actually, mostly the Arrowhead, if you know the Arrowhead of Minnesota. My protagonist, Krueger O'Connor, is the former sheriff of the fictional Tamarack County, Minnesota. He's a man of mixed heritage. He's part Irish and he's part Ojibwe. Because of that mixture in his heritage, and largely because of the area in which I set my novels, a lot of the stories that I write come from issues that rise out of the interface of those two cultures, white and Ojibwe. I've written about Indian gaming casinos and the effect that that's had both on the Ojibwe community and the surrounding white community. I've written about the ongoing controversy both in Minnesota and here over hunting and fishing treaty rights. I've written about the influx of the drug and the gang cultures on the reservation. Always at some level, my work deals with the whole question of racial prejudice. First book in the series, Iron Lake, came out in 1998. That was followed by Boundary Waters, Purgatory Ridge, Blood Hollow, Mercy Falls, Copper River, Thunder Bay, Red Knife, Heaven's Keep, Vermilion Drift, Northwest Angle, and last fall, Trickster's Point. The 13th in the series will be out this August, a book called Tamarack County, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Okay, that's who I am, that's what I do. And what I'd like to talk about is how at 62 years of age, I've finally seen two very important journeys in my life come together in a very satisfying way. I'm talking about my journey as a writer and my spiritual journey. And the place those two journeys come together is a novel called Ordinary Grace. I don't know how old you were or what the circumstances might have been when you first discovered that there's a great deal more to life than we can ever realize. For me, it was at the age of 6, and it was as the result of seeing a movie called The Incredible Shrinking Man. Anybody remember The Incredible Shrinking Man? Okay, for those of you who didn't raise a hand, The Incredible Shrinking Man was one of those grade B science fiction movies that was all over the big screens back in the mid-50s. It starred a guy named Grant Williams. Yeah, his career shrank to nothing after this movie. It was about this guy who's sailing on his boat off the coast of California, and he happens to pass through this really mysterious, luminous mist. Which, of course, turns out to be a radioactive mist, because everything back in the grade B movies of the 1950s was the result of radioactivity. And a couple of days after he passes through this mist, he begins to shrink. And the smaller he gets, the more his perspective of the world changes. So he gets to like the size of the Munchkins and the Wizard of Oz, and he hangs out with little people, and he sees the world as they see the world. He gets even smaller, and he gets to the point where the family cat who used to look to him for food looks at him as food. He gets really small, and he ends up battling a spider over a dropped crumb of birthday cake because he's starving. Very near the end, he's so tiny that he slips out of the house through the mesh on the window screen. And right at the end of the movie, he's so small that he enters existence on a molecular level. Hey, do you know what he discovers? There's a universe there too. And so what I understood when I walked out of that movie theater was, life is a great deal smaller, and a great deal larger, and a great deal more mysterious than I was probably ever going to be able to grasp. After that, my spiritual journey was pretty much shaped by my religious upbringing, and maybe like some of you, because I can see some contemporaries here in the group. When I graduated from high school, I thought I was putting all my spiritual considerations behind me. I graduated in 1969. For those of you who remember the world in 1969, you may remember that what we graduated into was a world that really was dominated by three things: sex, drugs, and rock and roll. You know? Really tough combination for spiritual concerns to compete with. So I left high school thinking I'd put my spiritual journey behind me. But you know, I never put my journey as a writer behind me. I've always wanted to be a writer, and I have always written. Probably that was due to my parents, my father particularly, who was a high school English teacher, but my mother as well. They raised their children as readers. When I was a kid, I never went to bed at night, I never went down for a nap without a story being read to me. So I grew up thinking of the world in terms of stories, and for whatever reason, I always wanted to be one of the storytellers. So, I always wanted to write, and I have always written. Would you like proof? Yeah. Oh, yes. Because I was going to do it anyway. Here's a poem I wrote in the 5th grade. It's called The Lone Wolf. It goes like this. The moon was hidden behind a cloud. The shadows were gone when came aloud the clear, keen voice of a wolf at bay. While still asleep in bed I lay. Suddenly, I awoke with a start, and felt the rapid beating of my heart, and heard the howling lone wolf's cry, and saw the black clouds in the sky. Then lo, the shining moon came out, and shone on the land round about, and the silhouette of a wolf I saw. It was then that I set my jaw. I hunted that wolf day and night, whether rain or the sun shone bright. I didn't stop to rest or play. I hunted that wolf every day. I never did catch up with him. He could run. His body was slim. Yeah, I know. 5th grade. But I'll tell you, even unto this day, from someone, he is running away. Thank you very much. Because more and more as I wrote those stories, spiritual considerations began to bubble up in the plots that I created. If you're familiar with the Cork O'Connor series, you may be aware of the fact that very often in the stories there's an undercurrent that involves the spiritual journey. It's something that comes very naturally for Cork O'Connor. He's a man with a foot in 2 different spiritual traditions. His white Catholicism, he's Irish Catholic, and his Ojibwe spirituality. And so he's very often trying to figure out where his own individual spiritual path lies. And the more I wrote the Cork O'Connor stories, the more I became aware that that continued to be a concern for me throughout my life. About 5 years ago, a story idea came to me. And it was not a Cork O'Connor story. And I knew that if I wrote this story, it was going to be a very risky proposition, because a very long time ago, my publisher set me down and they said to me, Kent, we only want Cork O'Connor stories from you from now on. And the reason for that was this. The 4th book I wrote in the series was a book called The Devil's Bed, and was the only other book I'd written that was not a part of the Cork O'Connor series. It's what we call a standalone thriller. Came out to really wonderful critical review, but nobody bought it. Who here has read The Devil's Bed? Okay, you are the only people in the entire universe who bought and read The Devil's Bed. And people stayed away from it not because it wasn't a good book. They stayed away because Cork O'Connor wasn't in it. And readers were unwilling to follow me to a place that didn't have Cork. And after that sales debacle, that's when my publisher set me down and said, "Can't." So I knew that if I wrote this story, it was going to be a very risky proposition. Clearly, my publisher wasn't going to be interested in it. I had no idea if anybody else was going to be interested. But the story was so compelling to me that I couldn't turn away from it. And so in the end, I cleared the decks, and over the course of the next 3 years, every moment that wasn't devoted to a contractual obligation for my Cork O'Connor novels, I devoted to writing a manuscript called Ordinary Grace. Now, there were two real motivations for writing Ordinary Grace. The first was this. I'd wanted for a very long period of time to write a story that would allow me to go back and revisit an important period in my own life. The summer I was 13 years old. I don't know what being 13 years old was like for the women in this group, but for guys, that's an important period in our lives. I mean, we're standing at a threshold. We're in a doorway. We've got one foot planted firmly in our childhood, and we've got one foot poised to step into our manhood, but we're not quite ready to take that step yet. I remember the summer I was 13 years old vividly. And so I wanted to go back, and I wanted to recall that summer and evoke it and put it on the written page in a way that readers could share that experience with me. That was one motivation. And the other was, I wanted to write a story that would allow me to explore more deeply the whole question of the spiritual journey. I told you Ordinary Grace is different from all of the Cork O'Connor novels. It takes place in the summer of 1961 in a small town deep in the Minnesota River Valley. It's the story of a Methodist minister whose beloved child is murdered. That's the compelling mystery component. But at heart, it's the story of how this terrible tragedy affects this man's faith, his family, and ultimately the entire fabric of the small town in which he lives. Honest to God, it's the best thing I've ever written. I put my heart into this book. I put everything I know about storytelling into this book. So where is it I've come after 62 years of this spiritual journey of mine? I'm going to read a section from Ordinary Grace that I think captures as well as anything I put in the book what it was that I was trying to say and the way I wanted to say it. Ordinary Grace is narrated by 13-year-old Frank Drum. His father, Nathan Drum, is the Methodist minister in the small town of New Bremen, Minnesota. Frank has a younger brother, Jake. And at one point in the story, Frank and Jake stumble across the body of a dead man beneath a railroad trestle just outside of town. The man is homeless. He's an itinerant. He's what, when I was a kid, we called a hobo or a bum. Because he's unknown in New Bremen and because they're never able to identify him, he's slated for a pauper's burial in the local cemetery. Present at the burial are Frank, his father Nathan, who has been asked to give a brief service for this unknown man, the county sheriff, the mortician, and a guy named Gus. Now, Gus is an important character in the story. He's a good friend of the Drum family. He's a guy who earns his living doing all kinds of odd jobs around New Bremen. Among them, he takes care of the cemetery. He waters the grass and mows it, and he digs the graves for the people who are going to be buried. In the early afternoon, my father got himself ready for the burial of the man we'd all begun calling simply the itinerant. And I told him I wanted to go along. He asked my reason, and I tried to articulate my thinking, although the truth was that I didn't really know. It simply felt right. I had been the one to bring the body to light, and it seemed fitting that I be there when it was delivered into a darkness eternal. I tried to say as much, but knew, even as I spoke, that I was saying it all wrong. In the end, my father studied me a long time, and finally allowed, as he saw no reason for me not to be there. His only requirement was that I dress as I would for the funeral of someone we knew, which meant my Sunday best. My father drove the Packard to the cemetery, which was set on a hill on the east side of town. The hole was already dug, and Gus was waiting, and Sheriff Krueger was there, though I didn't know why. And moments after we arrived, Mr. Vanderwall drove up in the hearse, and my father and Gus and the sheriff and the mortician slid the coffin from the back. It was a simple box of pine, planed and sanded smooth, and it had no handles. The men lifted and carried it on their shoulders to the grave. They laid it on wooden 2x4s that Gus had arranged across the opening, along with canvas straps for the eventual lowering into the earth. Then the men stood back, and I with them, and my father opened his Bible. It seemed to me a good day to be dead. And by that I mean that if the dead cared no more about the worries they'd shouldered in life, and could lie back and enjoy the best of what God had created, it was a day for exactly such. The air was warm and still, and the grass of the cemetery, which Gus kept watered and clipped, was soft green, and the river that reflected the sky was a long ribbon of blue silk. And I thought that when I died, this was the place exactly I would want to lie, and this was the scene that forever I would want to look upon. And I thought that it was strange that a resting place so kingly had been given to a man who had nothing, and about whom we knew so little that even his name was a mystery. And though I didn't know at all, and still do not, the truth of the arrangement, I suspected that it was somehow my father's doing. My father and his great embracing heart. He read the 23rd Psalm, and then he read from Romans, ending with, "For I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor present things, nor future things, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor any other creature will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord." He closed the book and said, "We believe too often that on the roads we walk alone, which is never true. Even this man who is unknown to us was known to God, and God was his constant companion. God never promised us an easy life. He never promised that we wouldn't suffer, that we wouldn't feel despair and loneliness and confusion and desperation. What he did promise was that in our suffering we would never be alone. And though we may sometimes make ourselves blind and deaf to his presence, he is beside us and around us and within us always. We are never separated from his love. And he promised us something else, the most important promise of all, that there would be surcease, that there would be an end to our pain and our suffering and our loneliness, that we would be with him and know him, and this would be heaven. This man, who in life may have felt utterly alone, feels alone no more. This man, whose life may have been days and nights of endless waiting, is waiting no more. He is where God always knew he would be, in a place prepared. And for this we rejoice. My father led us in the Lord's Prayer, and we stood in silence for a few moments, staring down at the simple coffin, which was pale yellow against the black of the hole beneath. And then my father said something that amazed me. He said, "It's a good day to be dead," which were almost the exact words I'd been thinking. And he said, "Let this man, in this place of beauty, rest forever in peace," which was also very nearly what I'd been thinking. And he nodded to the other men, and they each took a strap end. The mortician said, "Frank, when we lift, would you please remove the boards?" They lifted, and I bent and slid the 2x4s from underneath, and the men slowly lowered the coffin. When it was settled, they drew the straps back up, and my father said, "Gus, would you like a hand?" "No, Captain," Gus said. "I've got all day, and I intend to take my time." My father shook hands with his sheriff and with the mortician, and we returned to our vehicles and left Gus to the duty of sealing the grave with the dirt he'd removed to create it. So what is it I believe after 62 years of this spiritual journey of mine? It's pretty simple. I believe that when we're born, we come out of a great spirit, a great heart. And it's a spirit that runs through all creation, no matter how large or how small. And some people call this spirit God. And some people call it Allah. The Ojibwe call it Kichimanadu, which means the Great Spirit, or more accurately, the Great Mystery. And while we're here on this earth in this flesh, we're never alone. That Spirit is always with us. And when we die, we simply go right back into that great loving heart, into that great spirit out of which we sprang. That's it. That's all of it. Any questions? Now, before I take questions, there's one more thing I want to talk to you about this evening. I want to talk to you about number 13 in the Cork O'Connor series, Tamarack County. Here's where the idea for Tamarack County came from. Many, many, many months ago, I read a newspaper article about a guy who was convicted of murder and he was sentenced to be executed. He spent 20 years on death row waiting for that to happen. And toward the end of that period of time, one of these organizations that takes on the cases of these kinds of guys, to make sure that justice has in fact been done, took on this guy's case, began looking through all of the court documentation and the evidence files and everything. And in the course of their investigation, they discovered that at the time of this guy's trial, the prosecution had in its possession evidence that proved his innocence, and they never shared it with the defense. The prosecution had knowingly sent an innocent man to death row. And when this became public knowledge and the guy was released, and this was the part that just amazed me, he said he wasn't bitter about all those years he'd spent behind bars. But what he wanted was this. He wished that those people who put him on death row, knowing he was innocent, would somehow have to pay for the crime they'd committed. But that's not how our system of justice works. In our system of justice, the prosecutors are themselves immune from prosecution. So, that got me to thinking. I thought, what if? What if you've got this Ojibwe guy up in Tamarack County who's convicted of murder, and he spends 20 years in our prison down in Stillwater, and after 20 years there, evidence comes to light that proves his innocence. And it was evidence that the prosecution had in their possession at the time of his trial and never shared with the defense. And what if, when that becomes public information, the people who put that man behind bars, the judge, the prosecutors, the cops, begin to be murdered? And what if it was a young Deputy Cork O'Connor who was in charge of the investigation that gathered the evidence that put that guy in jail? Yeah! Oh, I love the setup for that one. I knew this was going to be a fun book to write. Had a great time writing Tamarack County. We just got the first of the review publication reviews in from Publishers Weekly. We just got a starred review for it. That's always a very nice way to kick off a new book. So August 20th, I'm working with Carol right now to see if I can't come back at some point to sign the hardcover of Tamarack County. So stay in touch with Carol. Stay in touch with Carol. Okay.